Live from the Plutopia News Network, this is the Plutopia Happy Hour. Our guest this evening, Nate Wilcox, who's going to be talking politics, and my political partner over there in South Austin, that's John Lebkowski. Hello, John.
Right on. How you doing?
And we're all here.
Hey, guys.
Nate used to be a political consultant when we met, and is now a mixed martial arts blogger and a host of the Let It Roll podcast.
You know, with the mixed martial arts thing going on there, we should have had Michael Buffer doing "Let's Get Ready to Pontificate."
I know. I'm having trouble seeing the difference though between like being a political consultant and writing about cage fighting. It seems like it's all about the same thing, right?
Cage fighters are actually a lot touchier and more sensitive.
Oh, really?
And more likely to physically assault you, but they also have much shorter careers and are much poorer. So politicians I never had any mercy on, but I do tend to treat fighters like mayflies that are only going to, why sweat a mayfly? They're only going to be around a little while. Fight promoters, on the other hand, are a very different animal, but no sleazier than anything I found in politics, or about as sleazy as, say, the Philadelphia mayor's race I worked on once. That was the sleaziest thing I ever personally worked on.
Was politics always been as toxic as it is now, and we just were less aware of it because we didn't have so much like social media?
I mean, I think it's always been a pretty ugly process. I think that the Supreme Court ruling in 74 that ruled that money was speech dramatically changed the game. And the transition of campaigning from something that was done by organizations to something that was done on television in the 60s and 70s was an enormous change, which essentially, the public nominally owns the airwaves. But in order for politicians to reach the public via the airwaves, politicians had to sell themselves to corporations to rent time on the public airwaves, which were given to said corporations for nominal fees, basically for free. And we've managed to corrupt our entire process, our entire system. And so we once had a party and the Democrats that represented the working class and the unions. And in order to keep up with the Republicans' spending on television, which they belatedly realized was effective in the mid-'80s, they essentially sold out the unions and the working class base in order to get corporate money. And now they're in a position where they're so addicted to corporate money, even though internet fundraising has changed the game. Like if you look at the statistics, Kristen Sinema is not actually that strong a fundraiser. You'd think that a woman who's selling out her political capital for political contributions would be a fundraising machine, but she's actually a pretty mediocre fundraiser. Somebody like AOC outraises her by a quantity, by factors, and AOC is not even a senator. So we're in a very weird time. I wasn't active in the 30s or the 20s. I don't think there were any golden ages in American political history, but I do think there have been periods when politicians were more responsive to the people. It seems like we're in the middle of a global leadership crisis where circumstances have changed dramatically, requiring radical action, and political leaders all across the world seem incapable of it. Xi in China might be the only world leader who's capable of radical action. And so far, we've seen a dramatic consolidation of power where he's the most powerful leader of China since Deng Xiaoping or since Chairman Mao even. And there's some speculation that he's consolidated that power because he feels like he has to take on the Chinese oligarchs because of these massive crisis level problems that are bearing down on every country on the planet. China has its own particular set of problems, in addition to the massive global environmental collapse, climate change, which is going to impact everything, whether cities will be habitable because of sea coastal flooding, whether agriculture is going to work because of changing weather patterns. And China has their own problems because of the one-child policy. Now they've got a demographic crisis that makes ours or Japan's look, like tiddlywinks, because they've got the largest population of workers that's about to retire and expect benefits in human history, and a much smaller working generation that's going to have to support their elders. So, these are the proverbial interesting times.
Well, in China, Chairman Mao always used to say about governing, he said, keep their mouths full and their minds empty, or keep their bellies full and their minds empty. But it's harder to keep minds empty now, I think, especially if you're trying to, like breed engineers and that sort of thing.
Very true. And also, social media has been this massive experiment in human behavior, and it seems pretty clear the verdict is in. It was a disastrously bad experiment in human behavior, that the premise that if we know more about each other, we'll like each other better, we'll understand each other better. I really did not want to know what my neighbor's political opinions were, or their musical opinions, or their movie opinions, or what they're doing on Tuesday. Somebody who's perfectly fine saying hello, 3 times a week, can become monstrously annoying when you discover their stupid opinions and they discover your stupid opinions.
The key thing there is that it's about opinions, right? People are more opinionated than ever, and they've got more amplification for their opinions. And, maybe we were better off when we talked about other things than just what our opinions were, and especially politics. I mean, to me, the disease now is that not everybody, but too many people are thinking about politics too much of the time.
I think the problem started when they did away with the fair use doctrine for broadcast media. That's when the slide began. But with the
it escalated it. I think that Supreme Court ruling in '74 really started the problem. But the fairness doctrine was a massive loss.
Yeah, and then social media comes along and just it's the problem on steroids, because there is no governing body really. It's it's a free fall, it's a cage max, I guess. Everyone's thrown into the internet cage. And
there is a governing body with social media. It's just that the governing body has chosen to optimize every aspect of these environments with the motto of "let's you and him fight," because that increases engagement, which allows them to get people spending more time looking at their apps, which lets them sell more advertising. And it's a disastrously bad model. The problem with Alex Jones is not that he's a loon or that he's spewing crank conspiracy theories. The problem with Alex Jones is that something like YouTube has recommended his nonsense to people billions of times. There's always been people like Alex Jones standing on street corners, and some people laughing at him, some people listening to him, but had a very limited impact. But once YouTube started recommending Alex Jones to people because they found his videos really got people watching and engaged, things got pretty disastrous pretty quickly. And our legal system, our system of controlling what people say, we give people enormous latitude to give freedom of speech. But the idea has been that if somebody uses their platform irresponsibly, that they'll be sued back in the line. But as we've seen with Alex Jones, even though he's not even contesting his legal fights, it's taken over a decade for the parents of these kids at Sandy Hook, who he has blood libeled repeatedly to a mass audience. Imagine your 7-year-old being shot by a random school shooting, and some jerk on the internet finds a way to make your life worse by telling his supporters you're an actor and that the whole thing was made up to take their guns away. And it's been found that one audience that's most receptive to Alex Jones is mothers of young children, the exact people who are the most afraid of their own kids being shot, because it's more comforting to hear, oh, these are just actors, this is all a big lie. And then they take that fear and anger and project it onto these poor parents of dead children. This is a mess.
And it's like, why would you do that? Apparently the argument was, when people argue there's a false flag, it's because it's in their interest to play down the fact that it happens. So this would be like people who are gun advocates really don't want to acknowledge when guns are used in these sort of like mass murders, And the more recent thing is January 6th where we now hear that the people at the Capitol were tourists just kind of hanging out.
Or Antifa, fiendishly plotting.
Or Antifa.
To
and the
frame
FBI.
right wing. Yeah.
And when all you have to do is watch there's plenty of video documentation. It's very clear what was happening there. Yet people are making these arguments and other people are believing them. It's kind of weird.
It's very weird. And you're seeing something like Tucker Carlson doing, he says one thing on Fox, it's bad enough, but then he's streaming programs that are just repeating the most egregious, nonsensical conspiracy theories. And you find these titans like Rupert Murdoch with Fox. Fox got such a backlash when they called the election for Biden, just reporting what actually happened.
Yeah.
That now they have bent over backwards to try to, humor this conspiracy mindset of people. And that's a very dangerous situation. I mean, that's innate to the nature of fascism. Fascism is a counter-logical or counter-rational ideology. It's not an ideology, it's an anti-ideology. That's one of the reasons fascism has always failed, because the premise is whatever makes big macho guys feel good is right. And hitting people is right, shooting people is right. If it pisses you off, do something about it. And that's where they're constantly running off cliffs and running into walls and, invading the Soviet Union and things like that. You've never had a fascist government that survived any length of time without the support of outside powers. You had Franco or Pinochet who lasted decades because the United States was propping them up. When fascist powers have been on their own, like Adolf Hitler or Mussolini or the Japanese, they've always overreached and always in a amazingly short period of time. It's a disaster.
Does that mean that this fascist experiment we're seeing now is going to end soon?
I do believe so, but it's going to end hard, especially if it takes over the American government. Trump was kind of a joke in that he didn't work very hard and he didn't have any serious ideology. He just kind of, watched TV quite a few hours a day, slept in, ranted, and he was not methodical. There were a couple of actors within his administration, Stephen Miller, who was quite active and dangerous. But there was no analog to Dick Cheney. Mike Pompeo would be as close as you got, but there was
maybe
nobody.
Steve Bannon, huh?
Well, Bannon was, never really in government, and so he's also.
But he had a plan. He had a whole strategy.
He had a plan. I mean, he more had a plan that he talked about than I think he actually had a plan. If you look at the gin blossoms on the man's face, it's clear, what he spends a good bit of his time on. That's not an issue Dick Cheney ever had. We haven't had the combination of, the second Bush administration was, I still think, the most dangerous and disastrous administration we faced in the century. And that's because they were pretty competent, even if they were insane. Rumsfeld, Cheney, Colin Powell, all these guys were major players who knew how to operate the government, and the government was on board with them. And so is the liberal media and much of the Democratic Party. With Trump, he triggered immediate mass opposition from the Democratic Party, from mass elements of the media, and from the dreaded deep state, which is a real thing. I mean, that terminology was coded by liberals and people who had worked in government, because there is a massive bureaucratic apparatus that lasts longer than the president's, that does what they want to do. And it's very hard. Like when we saw Biden withdrawing from Afghanistan, it was very hard for him to steer the ship. The Pentagon seemed to refuse to accept that Biden was serious about withdrawing the troops. And there's reason to believe that withdrawal was sabotaged from inside by people in the military-industrial complex who did not want us to leave Afghanistan because it's been this enormous money fountain. And that's the other thing. The Pentagon and the military-industrial complex is a for-profit business. Making war and winning wars is extremely low on their list of goals. Making money is number one, and they've been very successful at that.
Well, wars tend to be like money mills, right?
Yes, they absolutely do.
And I find it interesting how easy it was for Trump and his campaign to get the conservative Christians involved, people who were really offended by a lot of the things he had in his history, his misbehaviors, and how easy it was for them to say, oh, well, it's no big deal. He's our guy.
Yeah, but if you've been watching the evangelical movement, and keep in mind the dominant theology of the evangelical movement in the past 40 years has been prosperity gospel, which I would say it's closer to Ayn Rand or Anton LaVey's Book of Satan than it is the Christian Bible. It is one of the most perfect antichrist philosophies you can get. It's all about worshiping wealth. It's all about material wealth. It's all about fronting and hypocrisy. I mean, you can just go through verse by verse, and Jesus said not to do all of this stuff. This was the first things he said, I mean, like Joel Osteen locking his megachurch up when Houston flooded. That's not what a Christian teacher should be doing. They're supposed to be helping people, not protecting their wealth. And so I wasn't surprised at all by that. And if you look at the history of Jimmy Swaggart or Oral Roberts or Jim and Tammy Baker, they've got a long history of accepting egregious behavior from their leaders. And you can sort of understand it in two ways. One, hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue. Like, at least these guys say the traditional values are important. That's what matters to these people, not what they do. It's what they say. And the second thing is that they understand that these are their people. And so, like, when Rush Limbaugh was caught illegally buying, I mean, the dude deafened himself with substance abuse, taking so many downers, he literally deafened himself and ratted out his own cleaning lady because she was illegally helping him acquire more pills than he could get with prescriptions. People didn't even bat an eye. That's our Rush. They circled the wagons around this guy. Or like when David Vitter, the senator from Louisiana, was caught in the books of a New Orleans madam, and it noted that he liked to dress up in diapers. This is documented fact. Nobody cared. Nobody gave a shit. The guy got reelected. No problem. Sorry for cursing. I don't know if that's allowed here, but
yes.
Good. So,
this is a censorship-free zone.
The Republicans being absolute gross hypocrites shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, and their values are extremely fungible.
Politicians in general being hypocrites, for that matter.
Of course, but this is about the voters, not the politicians. And you got to remember the reason Trump got elected. Remember that 2016 Republican primary. I mean, you had all these clowns 8 years after the Bush administration failed. Do you remember how hard it was to find somebody who would admit that they were a Bush supporter in 2007 or 2008? Yeah. The very Texans who launched this jackass on the world were the first ones to deny they had anything to do with him. And yet the party continued to limp along, mouthing the same platitudes that Bush had mouthed. Romney didn't break with Bush in any substantive way. McCain didn't break with Bush in any substantive way. In 2016, you had Bush's brother running and saying nonsense like, my brother kept us safe. So when Trump was willing to come out there and say, I'm sorry, but your brother did not keep us safe. Have you heard of a little thing called 9/11? And the crowd, which was full of Bush supporters in South Carolina, that he had packed the crowd with his, insiders, all booed. All the pundits said, oh, Bush has gone too far because Trump has gone too far because there's nothing Republicans love more than the Bush family. No, they don't. By that point, everybody in the Republican Party, everybody in America knew that Bush was a manifest disaster, that all his policies were disastrous, and Trump seemed to be the person rejecting those policies and that dead, weight of old failed policies that people like Ted Cruz could only robotically repeat, classic conservatism, low taxes, less regulation, and nonsense. And so it was easy to root for Trump in that context. And then the Democrats essentially fixed their primary so that, Obama boxed Biden out from running. He discouraged Cory Booker from running. He didn't want Deval Patrick running. He cleared the lane for Hillary Clinton, except for that little pesky Bernie Sanders, who should never have gotten 40% in the American primary. That was simply because people were desperate for an alternative. I like Bernie Sanders fine, but clearly he's got many things that make him a very unlikely general election candidate. And yet, because Hillary Clinton is one of the most unpopular politicians in U.S. history, who's been deeply associated with every failed policy of the Clinton and Bush administrations. She supported the Iraq invasion. She supported, tearing down Glass-Steagall. She was all for the Bush economy, and was all for Obama. It was in Obama's administration, which I think at this point we have to say was a failed administration. By their fruits ye shall know them. Obama led to Trump. If FDR didn't lead to some Nazi, Joe McCarthy didn't get elected president. Harry Truman won a re-election, and Truman was not a popular politician, but because of FDR's legacy of delivering for people, the Democrats held on to power for decades after.
I don't think we've had a really decent president in my lifetime.
No, I mean, I think LBJ was the last almost decent president we've had.
Yeah, he was really good at
ruined it with Vietnam.
Kennedy might have been, who knows? I mean, he
I don't
really
think
have enough time.
The more I learn about Kennedy, the less impressed I am with him. And
he's coming back,
I heard his son was supposed to make an appearance.
Well, both of them, he and his son were going to show up, and Kennedy was going to become president again, and then he was going to hand it over to Trump, and something about how his son was going to be, I don't know.
Jack Ruby was going to be his vice president.
All that stuff going on in Dallas is classic apocalyptic millennial. I can't say the word millennial. Whatever. There's a word that's
millennial, right?
Millennialism.
Millennialism.
That we've seen in this country since at least the 1840s. That almost all the native or the Anglo-American religions that are unique to America, Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witness, all sprang off from this group, the Millerites, who literally thought the world was going to end in 1843 and gathered in a big field. And when it didn't, they splintered off into all these other factions and religions. So this is nothing new. It's just a particularly colorful strain of this kind of stuff. And we can see how crazy it's gotten.
You see this? There's this is one thing I had noticed. I'm not seeing as many of them here, but things like this. This kind of imagery. I had a volume of cartoons from the early 20th century, and there were probably dozens of these cartoons with guys carrying the end is near sign.
Yeah, they've been around for a long time.
There's always people like that, and the QAnon people are just kind of like bringing it into the present.
Well, back to religion, I found something very interesting, that the Southern Baptist Convention has reorganized and gone in a less fascist direction than they had been. They were essentially taken over by the Republican Party in the 1970s. And
it's the reverse. I think they took over the Republican Party.
Either or. there was a marriage there, and during the Trump years, apparently a lot of congregations began to be dissatisfied with the way the Southern Baptist Convention was managing the morals of the church. They were going along with all this stuff that Trump was doing and getting away with, and they were starting to lose membership. And they've actually had a lot of shakeups there in their governance. And I just think that's interesting, because they were preaching about how if Kennedy was elected president in 1960, there was going to be open warfare because the Catholics were storing guns and ammunition in the basements of all their churches and cathedrals. Yet that was a common story that was put out to the public, and it was ridiculous, of course, but a lot of people bought into it. It's easy to sell the big lie.
And it's also interesting that how that particular schism is, the Baptists and the Catholics are now close allies. The most conservative elements of the Catholic Church, that's who dominates our Supreme Court. And that old split between Protestants and Catholics has totally been papered over. It makes me think of the time a few years ago in Long Island when the Ku Klux Klan papered Black neighborhoods looking for recruits, looking to recruit Black people against Latino immigrants. So these things are all very fungible. We can find the people that were our most bitter enemies reaching out to us in a new alliance.
Well, they had that happening that was happening on 6th Street just a couple of weeks ago, where the people that were doing all the anti-Semitic postering in Austin showed up on 6th Street, and they were talking to Hispanics and Asians about those evil Jews, and it's like, oh, come on, people.
I know it's really amazing. But when you look at how Trump's performance with every category of minority voter improved from 2016 to 2020, there are many schisms, and they're not primarily ethnic, I don't think. I think that one schism the Democrats are reluctant to admit exists is this split between the college educated and everybody else. And nobody likes college educated people like us, and they never have. And we've always been sort of this cowbird that moves into political parties and makes them unpopular.
But because we make them feel stupid.
Well, and because we think we're so smart and know all the answers, and we're frequently as wrong as everybody else. And also because we tend to be the people, working class people don't hate the wealthy, they hate their managers. They don't hate the owners of the company. They hate that college educated smartass that was their teacher, that was the librarian, that was their manager at work. We are the face of authority, and authority has discredited itself so many times over and over. I mean, really since World War I. And it's just taken longer for America to catch up with the whole failure of the scientific Enlightenment rational model. I mean, people who lived through World War I in Europe generally walked away from a belief in progress. Americans were sheltered from that, and it lasted another century over here. And it's only been through the Iraq War and the disaster in Afghanistan and our inability to deal with COVID, et cetera, and also the manifest endless corruption in our political system. I mean, it's so obvious that at this point, when Joe Biden is elected as a moderate representing the centrists of the party, this is the senator from Delaware. They used to call Senator MBNA when that was a massive credit card company. This is a guy who he was Joe Manchin before Joe Manchin was Joe Manchin. And when you look at his agenda, it's not the progressives that are the wrench in the works. It's the Joe Manchins and the Kristen Sinemas, and it's impossible for somebody to argue that Kristen Sinema has a coherent political philosophy. She's clearly doing the bidding of donors who do not want these things to pass.
Yeah, donors, not constituents, right?
Yes, and she's opposing, her signature campaign issue in 2018 was repealing the Trump tax cuts, which she had voted against. Now she's opposed to that. She won't even tell people what it is she wants. And
there was an interesting thing about did you see the quote from Abigail Spanberger?
Of course. Yeah, of
yes,
course.
The representative of Virginia. Fault. She says, like, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal and stop the chaos. So apparently a lot of people feel that all this stuff that Biden is trying to do, the agenda that he has that they've been talking about, is like overstepping. It's more than anybody wanted him to do. And for whatever reasons.
The powers that be, it is overstepping. And remember, Biden launched his campaign telling a room full of donors, nothing is going to significantly change on my watch. That was his value proposition. And when you look at the Democratic Party, look at the way they mobilized and the way that CNN and MSNBC mobilized with them to crush Bernie Sanders after Nevada. I mean, the idea that Biden, nobody's ever lost Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada like that, and then roared into the lead the way Biden did. I mean, historically.
But why is Biden trying to do all this stuff now?
Because he knows he has to. He learned a few things from the Obama experience, one of which was you've got to at least pretend to deliver for people. And he saw what happened when Obama failed to do that. I mean, remember, Obama won the white working class handily in 2008. He won Indiana, one of the most absolutely racist states in this country. I mean, if you think Alabama is racist, you have not spent time in Indiana. That is a racist place. And Obama won that because people thought he was going to do something. I mean, he had every opportunity in the world, but he saw his constituency as being the banksters, not the people, not Main Street. And, everything he did was, Rahm Emanuel was the chief of staff, for God's sake. And, we've seen with his disgraceful failed administration in Chicago as the mayor, exactly what Rahm Emanuel is all about. That's what Obama is all about too. He was just able to, sort of wash it with this identity and this hope and change thing that people filled in the blanks. And Biden, I think, has learned that you have to deliver something. Unfortunately, he's just doesn't have any experience delivering for people. His experience is all doing the bidding of big corporate donors and then being sort of a racist reactionary Democrat. That's his whole history. And like the thing he said the other day when he reacted angrily to the idea that families who had been separated from their children at the border were going to get a $500,000 settlement from the government. I mean, if somebody who's had their child stolen through government malfeasance isn't eligible for a settlement, who is? But Biden reacted to that viscerally and angrily. And you've seen the way they've handled things at the border. Putting kids in cages is what they're all about, just like it was what Trump was all about. Obama still deported more people than Trump did. And I agree, obviously, unbridled immigration is a problem, but we had unbridled immigration for decades. And as long as it was unbridled immigration coming in to erode to steal union jobs essentially, and to do cheap construction projects, we were all for it.
Yeah.
But once it becomes children and women who are literally fleeing the results of climate change that we caused, Honduras, Guatemala, all those are very fragile environments and they're failing. And those people are desperate to get out. Plus the political situation. Obama backed a right-wing coup in 2009 in either, I can't remember if it was Honduras or Guatemala, but, thanks to Julian Assange, we know for a fact Hillary Clinton signed off on this right-wing coup, knowing what it was. Plus we take these gangsters, the MS-13 and other gangs that were born and they weren't born here, but they were bred and made in U.S. prisons. And we take them and deport them to a country much smaller and much less prepared to deal with them. And they essentially, between the right-wing fascists in charge that we put there and the gangsters that we sent there, these people are caught between a hammer and an anvil, and their crops are failing because of the climate disaster we caused. And now we're upset that they're looking for a haven. Just wait until these islands start going underwater. Do you know how many Bangladeshis there are? Do you know how low their sea level? They're barely above sea level. There's not going to be any stopping. There's 1 billion people in Bangladesh. They are going to be coming, and they're going to be pissed, and they're not going to be stopped.
How are you going to fix all this?
I'm not. I'm glad I can only die once, and that was baked in. I think that's, people need to recognize none of us can stop a global.
Sounds pretty
catastrophe.
Pretty hopeless at the moment.
Yeah. But at the same time, day to day, my life's wonderful. And, you look through history, and so many of the great poems and great songs and great books were written by people surviving or on the run from these disasters, So there's still a lot of good to be had. And, all we can do is throw the dice and do the best we can.
I got a question about January 6th. So we've all seen what happened on January 6th, but the thing that strikes me about it is I just wonder why it wasn't worse.
Because it wasn't deliberate. It wasn't planned. I think that the key thing was that the powers that be in the Pentagon were still of the mindset that, like, look, a peaceful transition of power is a core brand value of USA World Police. This money train stops fast if there's a gross, obvious coup in the United States. If you want to steal an election the way Bush did it in 2000, that's one thing, when it's all legal and you've got Joe Lieberman, the other party's VP nominee helping you do it, that's fine and dandy. But if you're going to do this crude, crass, let's rile up a bunch of yokels and send them storming into the Capitol building and hang Mike Pence, that is not going to play. And so, you had a few, from what we can tell, there were a few people in the Pentagon that were backing Trump wherever he wanted to go, but that most of the powers that be in the Pentagon, especially the ones that Miley, that had been out there in Lafayette Square and felt very burned by Trump, were not having it. So there was never going to be a National Guard unit or an elite military unit going in there and taking over the Capitol on Trump's behalf. And Trump didn't seriously plan this thing either. There were bad actors in that mob, and some of the worst actors were obviously the heads of the Capitol Police Department, who refused to protect the Capitol through what appears to be some kind of racist inertia, where they just couldn't believe that these white guys could be that big a problem. Had they been black, I mean, my God, can you imagine the tanks and the armory that would have been out to crush them? But, just like we saw in New York last week, when you have the police, and it ended up being like 34 New York cops who quit their jobs over being ordered to get vaccinated. And yet they took over the Brooklyn Bridge for hours, unopposed. When Black Lives Matter marchers tried to cross the Brooklyn Bridge just to say, hey, please stop killing people, they were crushed. I mean, they were met with absolute police riots, And so this innate partnership between police and military and fascists, that's just a character trait. And when you've got a corrupt, sclerotic old boys network, I mean, the Capitol Police have not had to seriously protect the Capitol from anything probably ever. And we saw what a clown show it was when push came to shove. And we're just incredibly lucky. I mean, literally, like the one guard who led the rioters away from the Senate saved maybe the whole republic. I mean, what would have happened if those lunatics had gone into the Senate chambers while the senators were still there with only a handful of guards to protect them? Somebody could have gotten killed. Somebody who mattered could have gotten killed. But it's still really appalling and frightening to see Merrick Garland, Biden's attorney general, whose concerns seem to be, number one, protecting executive privilege, and number two, look forward, not back. Like, he literally does not want to prosecute this stuff. And one of the judges recently chided the DOJ because the introduction, their first opening speech would say things like, this was the most serious attack on American democracy since the Civil War. And then, 7 minutes later, get to the punchline, and we recommend a misdemeanor prosecution for this guy. And nobody who was a major politician is even being investigated in a serious way. I mean, we've got the Trump memos that show his legal team was saying, here's how we could steal the election. We know that Josh Hawley and Marjorie Taylor Greene and other members of Congress met with these rioters, that somebody inside Congress showed them exactly which entrances were vulnerable, and they're not investigating this. Like, if you read some Roman history, when they had somebody try to kill the consul of Rome, they didn't look forward and not back. They cut people's heads off for that shit, because you can't have a republic if people are organizing outside the law and trying to kill the elected leaders of said republic. And I think the issue is that the generation we have in leadership, and all the generations that are active currently, have not really faced life or death situations. I know for a fact that Mark Warner doesn't even play chess, has never played Risk, okay? This is a U.S. senator who has no interest or understanding of military affairs. Nancy Pelosi, I guarantee you, has as little interest in that. And if you look at the history of coups and revolutions, things like the Russian Revolution came down to Trotsky had a naval unit in his pocket that managed to get to the Kremlin before anybody else got there. And that's all it was who got there firstest with the mostest. And you have, and it was so disconcerting to watch liberals like myself and my friends on Facebook reacting to this obvious threats of sedition by saying, boy, is the army going to teach you guys a lesson. Like the attitude is somebody's going to come in and save us. These authorities we're always appealing to, that we're saying, oh, the Republicans are hypocrites, or, oh, the way they campaigned in Virginia wasn't fair. There's no referee. Freddie DeBoer said that in his newsletter the other day. There's no referee, and there's no daddy coming to save us. The way a democratic republic works is through citizen engagement and leadership. And George Washington wouldn't have put up with this shit. George Washington knew, oh, here comes a bunch of goons with torches and pitchforks. Time to get Alexander Hamilton on a horseback with some guys that are trained with muskets and shoot said goons. Look up the history of the Whiskey Rebellion. I mean, it's
historically, militaries have been the people that changed government, especially in
absolutely.
In recent times, there have been so many coups, but if we could for a minute, we've been talking about national politics. Can we redirect to Texas politics? I found it interesting. You were talking about Manchin. The Texas Democrats are going to be losing their Manchin. Eddie Lucio is going to be not running for re-election. Very unexpected, because he had already announced that he was running. And I found that was interesting. What do you think of that change? What moved him in that direction?
I can't speculate on that. I mean, I think that the congressional seat that the Republicans took that nobody expected them to take might have been a factor there. I don't know. I'm not privy to his discussions with his donors, so I don't know. I know for a fact that at least one sitting Democratic congressman had his entire campaign invisibly managed by a Republican consultant. This started in 2004. The guy was elected in 2006 and is still sitting in office. Voted against the bankruptcy bill despite representing one of the poorest districts in the country, in Houston. But the corruption is endemic, in all aspects of American governments, and the sitting Democratic Party, and the sitting Democratic Party in South Texas in particular. That has been a historical cesspool, going back to LBJ stealing elections there in the 40s or the 60s, like 50s, 48, I think was the one with the ballot box and the valley that was stuffed. And somebody like Lucio is following a different calculus than what's apparent. I remember when Joe Lieberman lost the Democratic primary to Ned Lamont in 2006, and I was working for Mark Warner at the time, and Warner World went all hands on deck immediately to help Joe Lieberman, not to help Ned Lamont, the Democratic nominee. And I realized at that point that the powers that be within the Democratic Party, it's not about winning elections. It's not, what you see is what you get. Just like what you saw when the Democrats nominated a socialist for the mayor of Buffalo. Now, not the whole party didn't attack her. Schumer and Gillibrand supported her, but massive elements of the party attacked her, and she lost to the old corrupt mayor running a write-in campaign. And she made some mistakes of her own. Was a terrible candidate in her own right. But what I realized was the goal is not to get reelected. We're not talking about a generation of Sam Rayburn's here. Sam Rayburn was one of the most powerful, most historically significant speaker in the House, only speaker of the House to ever get a standing ovation when he finally broke the power of the old racist dinosaurs and got the civil rights bills passed. He went home to a very modest home because he didn't take bribes. And his goal was to serve the people, and his goals were political power, and getting reelected really mattered for him. But what I realized with Lieberman at that point was it wasn't about winning or losing elections. It was staying in good with the lobby, because then you get a big job. Your kids get big jobs. Look at Howard Dean. He opposed the Iraq War basically out of a common sense position, but it turns out he was just as neoliberal and conservative as the rest of them. And if you look at his shameful career as a lobbyist, supporting insane right-wing Iranian militias and things, and campaigning, working for big pharma, that the end goal is to be in good with the lobby, not to be in good with the electorate. So I assume Lucio had some calculus like that, and that there's probably a power broker who told him, Eddie, it's time to step down. You're not useful to us right now. I could be totally wrong. It could be health issues. I mean, there's lots of reasons. Campaigning sucks, and there's lots of reasons why people step down. He could have a family obligation, whatever. I mean, he might have just woken up one day and said, I'm tired of this. But my experience with Lucio has been calling him the Joe Manchin of Texas Democrats is being extremely generous. So,
well, what about Abbott? Now, you're talking about people. I mean, looking at what he's been doing lately, he either wants to run for president or be the Trump's vice president. That's all.
He clearly does, and you know, Abbott's one of these people that you keep going, gosh, he's smarter than this. What is he doing? Like, he recently doubled down on, I can't remember the name of the rep that's trying to push, you know, every school library in Texas to tell them what's in their library. And here's your list of forbidden books that you're going to be in trouble if you have. And Abbott backed that to the hilt and yet refused to name a single book when asked. You know, his posturing is extremely shallow.
It's all dog whistles, basically.
Yeah. And he's trying to adapt to a changing Republican electorate. And he's being challenged from the right in his primaries. I don't know if you guys seen any of the billboards and others from these lunatics that are opposing Abbott from the right. And he's much more worried about than he is about Beto or Matthew McConaughey, because nobody in 25 years has won as a Democrat. The Republican primary is where all the action has been for this entire century. So he's worried about the Republican base, and the Republican base, as we saw in Daily Plaza the other day, has gone completely nuts. And I mean, I think part of that is, I don't want to say rational, but an understandable response to our circumstances. We had this massive pandemic. It killed more people in the United States than anywhere else in the world. Going into this, you know, The Economist magazine said our healthcare system was the #1 most prepared for a pandemic. Obviously, that wasn't the case. I would much rather be in China as far as their COVID policies than here. 700,000 people at least died, probably 1 million if you look at the excess deaths. When you've got this cognitive dissonance of everybody you know, everybody you trust is saying, are you getting that crazy, terrible vaccine? Don't risk your kids' lives with that awful vaccine. Then you've got dad going to the hospital and dying of the disease that you didn't want to get vaccinated against. You know, that kind of breaks your brain. And when it's obvious that the weather is screwed up, that snowpocalypse we had last year, that was freaky shit that would not have happened basically for the entire Holocene epoch. You know, that wasn't a 1 in 500 years weather freak. That was a 1 in 10,000 years. And especially people who are farmers and ranchers and see this stuff daily and see how spring is coming earlier every year. The rain isn't falling when it used to. It's not just like a 10-year drought like we had in the 50s.
See, the problem is it might not have been a 1 in 10,000 years.
Well, it's yeah. I mean, this is the thing is we're like, I think this could happen again this year. I mean, what we've discovered is that once you get the global climate out of balance, all bets are off. I mean, I was reading a thing the other day that saying during the Pleistocene, you could not have had agriculture like we have now because the weather was too violent and unpredictable. We evolved our civilizations in this 10,000 year period of remarkably stable weather. We essentially grew up in the Garden of Eden and ruined it. And now, you know, the consequences are just beginning to come home. So I think when people flip out like this, it's because no leader is willing to say America is a failed power. We are facing a massive, not just one climate crisis, but multiple environmental crises that are all coming down on us at once. So when you have somebody like the Congresswoman who said, nobody elected him to be FDR, we just wanted to get things back to normal. Talk about privilege. You know, anybody saying that is living in a sumptuous home, has a very stout retirement account. They are not watching their grandkids, you know, looking at this planet that is falling out from under us. She probably hasn't had anybody die from the opioid epidemic, which is a bigger killer than
from COVID.
Yeah, or from COVID, you know. And it was interesting, as soon as when COVID seemed to be striking globe-trotting world conquerors, like when they had that big corporate conference in Boston that was a super spreader event, boy, were they scared. and boy, were they reacting. But when they realized, oh, this is mostly just killing people who work in slaughterhouses and who are janitors at hospitals and prisons, who cares? Let's get this economy going again, and we've seen this society throw wave after wave of people overboard since the oil crisis in 1973, frankly. And it's getting to the point where, unless you're in the top 1%, you're very precarious. A lot of us are very lucky to be in the upper income brackets, or not a lot of us, but a few of us are lucky enough to be in upper income brackets and still feel very precarious because of the way inflation is going, the way housing prices are blowing up and all these things. That's not how it used to be. And so it's understandable that people's minds are breaking because nobody's explaining this stuff to them. You've got Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, all three telling people these nonsense narratives that don't explain reality at all. And you can tell because the pundits are never right about anything. They never get even the most simple prediction right. Like, how shocked were they when Afghanistan was a disaster? I mean, they hadn't covered Afghanistan for all of 2020. And then suddenly it's the worst thing that ever happened. They didn't care about Afghanistan at all, or they would have covered it at the time. Anybody following closely knew it was a disaster happening. And that there was, we were losing ground to the Taliban no matter how much money we poured into it. And then when you see the pundits that are literally so angry, they're almost in tears going after Biden's Secretary of State, Blinken, you're like, what are these people so upset about? That's because they're so invested in that military industrial complex. They are literally fleas on the dog's ass of the military industrial complex. And the idea that the dog is not invincible is really scary to them. And they're not smart. I mean, if you're a talking head on TV, your skill set is basically being calm on camera and having a nice haircut. These are not thoughtful people, that are reading the briefings and understanding what's going on. These are nitwits who run around repeating what Don Lemon said on CNN or what Tucker Carlson said on Fox. And then when reality hits them in the face like that, they shit their pants.
I see a bit of irony in the fact that a lot of the Republican politicians that have been spewing all of this misinformation about COVID, about climate change, and they're directing it to their followers, and the followers are the ones that are going to either die or suffer because they believed this guy or this woman, whoever it was that was lying to them. And are they even having that conversation in the Republican Party that your lies are killing your base?
They don't seem to be. And that has been a real head scratcher as well. But I think their bet, they saw how Trump won over elements of the working class, including Latin elements of the working class, African-American elements of the working class. They recognize that even if they kill their older white base, there's still a working class that's primed for reactionary nonsense because the professional managerial class is so full of shit and so clueless. You get Democrats who simultaneously say critical race theory isn't a thing. It's not really in the schools. Plus, it's not so bad. It's actually a good thing. No. It's one or the other. And it's not a good thing. It's racial essentialism. It's the opposite of what MLK said. And letting the Republicans make something that's not even a part of their policy. The Republicans are masters at finding new words to put on old fears. And this is just the backlash to Black Lives Matter, which we've had every time we've had a significant advance in civil rights in this country's history. There's been a vicious backlash. You have the Civil War and Reconstruction, then you get Jim Crow as the vicious and brutal and lasting reaction to that. You have civil rights, then you get Ronald Reagan and the endless and the prison industrial complex. We got Black Lives Matter for an exciting summer when it seemed like things might change. And now we're getting critical race theory ground into our faces.
Well, I think I think you may have mischaracterized that a little bit because I haven't really heard people say, well, it's really okay. I mean, kind of what I've been hearing and what I understand is that critical race theory is an academic thing that is just part of that, the academic hoopla that they churn in like graduate schools and stuff like that. And it's never going to make its way into K-12. And it's really not
Very
going
true,
to
but
necessarily have that much influence. So, why worry about it? It's just like, people talk about.
But that's the exact argument I'm pointing out is a failed argument. That's what sets you up for failures like we had in Virginia, because at the same time, critical race theory isn't that big a deal. Did you just say Latin or Latino? Excuse me, sir, it's Latin X. My Mexican friends will slap my face if I call them Latin X.
Yeah, you're talking about woke stuff. Yeah.
And look at the people who jumped on the woke train. Microsoft is out there talking about Native American, blah, blah, blah. Microsoft, the most rapacious and awful corporation until Facebook came along. Every corporate HR department in the country got all in on, hey, I get it. This is about telling people how to talk. And if you say the wrong thing, boy, are you in trouble. You could be fired immediately, and that freaks people out. And that's not cool. That's not racial progress. This is what you get instead of, expanding Medicaid to cover glasses and hearing aids. This is what you get instead of family leave, is this bullshit terminology stuff.
And it gets like overblown. And there's this another one of the buzzwords, I guess you'd say, or buzz phrases, cancel culture. People talk about cancel culture. Well, when has there ever not been people being canceled? But suddenly we've decided it's a culture and that only the left does it. And of course, the right doesn't do it. When the right takes somebody out, it's justified. But when the left does it, it's cancel culture.
The chicks, formerly the Dixie Chicks, about cancel culture.
Exactly.
They went from being one of the most popular country western acts in the world to dead in the water, literally overnight.
That's the people, if there's any still left, who were on the blacklist about cancel culture.
Oh yeah,
but it goes way back.
Then you get somebody like Bill Cosby, who has 24 women that he's paid settlements out to in court because he raped them, going to jail on, maybe the case was a push, but that wasn't cancel culture. That was consequences. Same thing with Weinstein, and R. Kelly. And it's at the same time, there have been some mid-tier small timers that have been canceled, and they tend to be sort of left of center Democratic activists and pundits who were pushing for that economic stuff that the powers that be don't want to share, and then said something wrong. You get things like Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg, who are anything but friends of the people, who are the most corporate sellouts. Buttigieg is Secretary of Transportation during the worst transportation crisis of my lifetime, and he's talking about running for president. How about doing your job? If you say, why isn't this guy doing his job? They say, you're homophobic. He's on paternity leave. Did FDR have people on paternity leave during World War II? No, he had them doing their jobs. And if they
I think that's I think that's endemic in politics. I think it's the biggest problem ever is that people are totally focused on getting elected and staying in power, and they're not doing shit. They're not doing anything. It's like Trump sitting on his ass in the White House watching television, as you mentioned earlier. It's like they're all doing that.
Or
they're not doing their jobs.
Running one of the worst campaigns I've ever seen, and then blaming progressives in Congress when he lost. They're not the ones who told you to run ads about Trump 24/7. They're not the ones who told you to send emails multiple times a day saying our campaign's in crisis, give us money. This was an amazingly badly run campaign. Any Democratic activist in Virginia could tell you things were not going well months ago when McAuliffe didn't even start his campaign until way, way late. And then they do the same old bullshit of, well, it's these dang progressives. Biden went too far left. As Atria said, you can't get none more centrist. How much more centrist could Biden get? None more centrist is how much. So, it's just the same shit, different day.
Well, Nate, I hate to tell you this, but our culture is just about to cancel you. We're about out of time. We're going to need to have you back real soon to continue because we only dipped our toes in the water. There's a lot more water to explore.
It's easy to get drowned. Thanks so much for having me. It was really fun.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
this was great. We had a great time. Looking forward to the next one.
Likewise.
All right, sir. Off we go.
Adios.